In the shadows of the city streets, lost and searching for a love that meets, empty hands and weary eyes, longing for a glimpse of brighter skies.
Hello everyone, welcome to the first video of what I hope will become a series of Bible studies, each between 10 and 15 minutes long, 20 minutes maximum if the topic that day really requires it. And being that this is the first video, I'd like to start with something foundational. Hopefully you don't find it overly basic or simple, but I think it's important to start somewhere. And today I think that's sinful living or lawlessness, right? In Romans chapter 7, verses 7 through 13, Paul speaks about the nature of sin and living a redeemed life. He talks about how the law helps to expose a person's sinful living, how they are living for themselves, essentially, and how the law really helps us to understand how to live with God and work and worship God and how to deal with sin. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4, the Bible describes sin as lawlessness, acting in direct violation of God's authority. The root of sin is an intentional rejection of God and His will. When we choose our own desires over God, we demonstrate a lawless heart. You think about, say, California, the legal books there, the law books, penal code, vehicle code, health and safety code, business and professions code. Point is, if you stack them all, they are floor to ceiling. A person can commit like 3 felonies a day, but that doesn't make them a criminal because they did not intend to break those laws, right? They didn't say, this is what I want to do, knowing that it's illegal. Think of speeding, right? So many people say, well, I'm not a criminal, I only speed. Well, let's look at that. I've been driving down the road and look down and see that my speed is high. So I'm speeding, so what do? I slow down. And I'm thankful that there was no highway patrol there to stop me and give me a ticket. But some people, and sometimes me, let's be honest, speed intentionally. There's, we make a science out of it. Well, if I only go 4 miles an hour over, well, it won't be worth the cops' time and they'll leave me alone. But realistically, that's sinful living. It's lawlessness. We demonstrate that by saying, despite what the law wants, I'm going to do what I want. It is my desire to get to my destination faster. So what do? We put the safety of everyone around us in jeopardy. It's selfish. Now, I don't want to harp on speed. I know it's a touchy subject for most, but I just wanted to use it as an example that we all have an experience with, and how we can cross that bridge from making a mistake to actually intending to do something that's illegal or unlawful. And it's that mindset that separates us from God and His authority, right? It creates a cycle of rebellion and disobedience. The more I speed and the more I get away with it, the more I'm likely to do it because there's been no consequences. My conscience becomes harder and harder until I drive that way constantly. It begins a cycle of disobedience, and it's rebellion against the law. But in addition to our conscience, it's that innate understanding of right versus wrong, good versus evil, moral versus unmoral. It's that law that God wrote on our heart from the very beginning. But God gave Israel the law through Moses. This law was meant to show them how to live in a relationship with God, how to worship God, how to deal with sin. because without it, they didn't know what actions specifically were sinful or not. They only had their conscience, just like the Gentiles, you know. But again, as Paul says in the same book of Romans, that as long as the Gentiles or the people before the law did what they knew was right, they were covered by God's mercy. But over time of living in a rebellious way, our conscience was seared, is hardened, basically stone. And we see that in Romans chapter 1, where Paul describes people who chose not to honor God anymore. So God let them do whatever they want. He left them to their own consequences. And because they chose themselves over God, they chose the alternative to God and everything that entails. But they didn't realize how bound they had become. And it's in those bonds of sinful living that we create a prison. You know, a person living that way, that's like a prisoner in a dungeon constructed of lies and deceit. You know, those looming walls that tower over them and feel so repressive, it's only as strong as they allow it to be. It's up to them. It's based on their choices and their decisions. But over time, you know, the prisoner surrenders to that environment. They become part of the system. You know, and our enemy has carefully crafted this prison where inmates are both the guards and the tortured. That's why, or how rather, sin separates us from God, removes us from the source of true freedom and our authority, creates a void. And it's in that void that we are most vulnerable, right? It's in that void where humanity created the most prolific God the species has ever served, ourselves, right? It's not Satan, it's not Baal or Asherah. The God that people create is ourselves. Often we elevate our own desires above God's will. You know, Adam and Eve exemplified this in the garden when they chose their will over God's. They desired to elevate themselves to be like God. As Proverbs 16 and verse 18 says, and I'll paraphrase, but pride comes before destruction, right? And a haughty heart before a fall. Do we see in the garden how Adam and Eve had pride? Well, we do if we understand that it was pride that caused them to choose their own desires over God. We see this in Lucifer, right? In Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12 through 14, we read of the 5 I wills, right? This is essentially Lucifer's declaration of how he's going to make himself like God. Pride. He desires to exalt himself. Doesn't care what God wants anymore. It's about what he wants. And in his anger, our enemy approached Eve, right? She was vulnerable and likely naive. You know, the Bible tells us that she knew the truth, right? Somebody gave it to her. Now she added a little bit. Don't even touch it. But where was Adam? We have to assume he was right there. I mean, the Bible says he was there. Why didn't he stop? Why didn't he stop her? Well, again, the assumption is that he was on board. He agreed with her decision. She, or they, made a conscious decision to choose to serve themselves. You know, the Bible tells us that Eve saw the fruit was pleasing to the eye, good for food, right? And desirable to make one wise, like God. And isn't that what people today chase? What people since the beginning of time have been chasing? To be like God. to seek to be treated and revered as divine. Humanity, we started in the garden, a perfect environment. We were designed to be servants for God. God gave us dominion over creation to serve his will, but we chose rebellion instead. I guess we could make an analogy in that of a son, whose father owns a business. The son has three options. He can start his own company without the father's protection or resources, do his own thing, right? But any mistakes or any shortcomings, he's responsible for. He can leave and work for a different master, seeking greener pastures. Maybe he's looking for protection when his own endeavors fail. Or three, he can continue to serve the father as a subordinate leader until his inheritance. Choice is all of ours. Are we going to leave because we want to do something different? Or are we going to stay with the Father and serve his will? Thankfully, in our fallen state, God's always there calling us back. He reminds us that all we have to do is surrender. As Paul mentions in chapter 6 and verse 20 of Romans, while we were out doing our own thing, we were free from the obligation to do what was right. But it did not, however, excuse us or exempt us from consequences of living that way. And that's what the prodigal son found. Outside of our father's company, outside of him, we bear all the risk without protection. Mistakes and failures are entirely on us. Within the father's company, he bears the burden. Ultimately, it comes down to this. What does working for our father entail? Are we allowed to make mistakes? Will he ever fire us? These are all questions that we wrestle with at one time or another. Working for God means putting him above ourselves. It means abandoning our will and taking up his will as our own. Not two competing wills, not two wills that are parallel, wanting the same thing, but one and the same. We cannot serve our own desires on the side. Why? Because God demands loyalty. He deserves it. And because he's the creator of everything, we don't have a choice in that. And if we really do surrender, our character will change. Not because we force it, right? Not trying to earn salvation, but because once we surrender our will to his, the things we do, the things we want, our desires will necessarily change. And that will be evident to the people around us as our fruit. There will be mistakes. There will be lapses in judgment. But as long as we don't do them intentionally, we're covered. Our Father will never fire us. But as we've seen, in reality and in real life, we can quit. Go back to the business analogy. That son has the option to quit. Prodigal son quit. The prodigal son's brother was still working for his father. There was work to be done. There were rules and regulations. There were obligations. But once the prodigal son repented and surrendered to his father, everything was made right again. But on to the sacrifice, right? The topic for our next video. When Paul tells us that offering our bodies as a living sacrifice is our reasonable service, he's not saying that it's our extravagant service. He says it's our reasonable service. And it's in that sacrifice, that living a life in that sort of sacrifice, that we learn how to maintain God in his rightful place in our life. He's in his rightful place whether we agree with it or not. But living that life of sacrifice helps us to maintain him or his position in our life. Next video, we'll dive more into this idea of sacrifice, especially being that we've just come off of the time of the year for the Daniel fast. I hope this video has given you some value. If it has, please like and subscribe. Share this video. I know everybody on YouTube says it, and I'll be honest, until I started running the Dream Nations YouTube channel, I did not realize just how important it is dealing with the YouTube algorithms. It's free, it doesn't take any time, and it really does help this ministry. So again, I hope to see you soon, but in the meantime, God bless, and I hope you have a good day.
Meets you where you are, open arms and open hearts. He will never let you part.